so in the recently concluded EU elections, socialists in Western Europe really took it on the chin, and it has that grade school drama teacher to the north of us, who the Canadians made their prime minister, a little worried about his future.
We have seen around the world a rise of populist right-wing forces in just about every democracy that we've seen. And it is of concern to see political parties choosing to instrumentalize anger, fear, division, anxiety. My approach has always been to respond to it, to understand it, and to look to solve it, to roll up our sleeves, work hard, and with ambition for this country and for our future. And I continue to be convinced that Canadians are thoughtful about the challenges we're facing and ready to see them solved, rather than just allow themselves to be have their anger amplified without any solutions offered.
More sleeve rolling, that's what's required, as per usual. Yeah, put in the work. That's interesting rhetoric coming from somebody who behaved like a totalitarian despot for 3 years during COVID. And just generally speaking, but he is right to be concerned because Pierre Poilievre is coming for him in the next election up there as well. For more on what came to pass in Germany, France, Belgium, pleased to be joined by Freddie Gray, who is the deputy editor of The Spectator and host of the Americano podcast. Freddie, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hello, Dan Lamey. Lovely to be with you.
Good to have you. And pretty, at least surprising to some, I saw some tears flowing in Brussels. So the leftist heads of state were not expecting what the electorate delivered in places like France and Germany and Belgium.
Well, they don't seem to have been expecting it, which sort of shows how pig-headed and stupid they are, because the polls clearly indicated that these right-wing parties were going to do very well. The European media all insists on lumping them all together as far-right. There are far-right parties in Europe. Even by my pretty right-wing standards, there are parties in Europe I consider far-right. But most of them, including Le Pen, which obviously her movement, or National Rally it's called now, but it comes from the National Front, and it has, Vichyite, faintly fascist, certainly anti-Semitic origins. But nowadays, it's very similar to the Trump movement in what it stands for and what it believes in.
Well, interestingly,
and it's very, very popular.
Well, interestingly too, I mean, just specific to France and that National Rally party, Jordan Bardella, this 28-year-old who's the new party leader, that sort of speaks to a changing of the guard, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, Marine Le Pen is still the boss, but Bardella is the great star of the party. And so what happened on Sunday night was that we had these European elections. Macron, the French president, was completely embarrassed and humiliated by them. They did much worse than even the most negative polls predicted. And he called this snap election a parliamentary election. It's worth remembering about Europe, by the way, that these parliamentary elections, they sound important, but they're not. They're really just a very convincing opinion poll, because the European Parliament has quite limited powers. But Macron then called it a real election in France, a parliamentary election in France. It won't remove him from power, but it's like a congressional election would be the comparison in America. He looks as though he's going to lose it pretty badly. But the theory is that his plan, his tactic, is to bring the National Rally, bring Marine Le Pen's lot into power, and then asphyxiate them from there. And he can do that in lots of ways. He can, perhaps prove that they are incapable of governing, or he can, France's Interior Minister today is suggesting that Marine Le Pen would cause an economic crash as soon as they had any role in government. And so there's quite a sort of project fear that could happen should Marine Le Pen come into government. It'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. We have a piece in The Spectator this week, our magazine, saying that actually Macron thinks he may be playing a very clever game, But really, the problem is he's been completely outflanked, and his popularity now is shot because the French economy is already in a terrible state. Immigration is a huge concern
Right.
for lots of
Well, that's what I was
French
going to ask you.
people.
What's the number one issue motivating this?
It's immigration overall, but obviously in the last few years, it's been the cost of living crisis and what we call inflation poison, which is poisoning governments everywhere. I think we see it with Joe Biden, even though he keeps insisting that it's not, that it's under control. I think Americans don't feel that way. Am I right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you're right.
More beautiful lies. Yes.
Well, but
Yeah. Well, inflation in Britain has been very bad, and Europe, obviously, it's affected it too, and the cost of living crisis has been bad there too. So, that's the more immediate problem. The bigger problem, and what really drives the growth of these parties, because these parties have been growing. You look at Meloni in Italy, you look at the AfD in Germany, who came second but ahead of the governing party. The issue that drives all of these parties is immigration, and it's a great concern about huge waves of immigration that have happened in the last 20 years, and the failure of the ruling class, the governing classes, to protect their electorates from the social, economic, economic's debatable, I suppose, but social and criminal costs. You know, the crime waves that have happened in certain parts of Europe are connected to immigration, and there's no point denying it.
everyone I talk to who's been to London recently, and I have not, says, there's no British left. And it's basically the realization, you mentioned the last 20 years or 30 years of the Western Europe promoting multiculturalism, which, sounds very lovely in concept, but I mean, it just sort of was a fancy way of saying open borders. And now you're at a place where it's very difficult to sort of reset the table, and so the only thing to do is for the electorate to revolt against what they engendered, I guess.
Well, yes. I mean, to take the British example, a lot of people feel very angry about immigration levels. And just in the last 2 years, we've imported 700,000 people. And for a country the size of Britain, that's an awful... Sorry, last year we imported 700,000 people. The year before we imported slightly less, but about 1.5 million in the last 2 years. That's a huge number of people for a country of our size. It's like one of our more significant cities, like Coventry. The population is that. So trying to sort of accommodate, house, find schooling, find hospital places and so on for all these people is incredibly difficult. And the economic argument for it is, of course, that it helps drive down inflation because of labour and so on. And cheaper labour means lower inflation. But it doesn't make any sense in terms of social living in Britain or living, in Britain, particularly in the cities. And, I mean, we have this party, Reform, which would be the sort of equivalent of, perhaps not the equivalent of Le Pen, but maybe more like an equivalent of Meloni in Italy. And they are now campaigning quite vigorously in this election. They stand to do very well, but they won't win many seats because of our peculiar parliamentary system.
But I mean, in Britain, in Britain, I mean, Sunak and the Conservatives are going to take a hammering, and it'll be perceived as, but by the leftist press corps, it'll be perceived as, oh well, they've stemmed the tide of right wing populism. But no, that's just punishing the Conservative Party, the Tories, therefore being basically being leftists. Sunak and Conservatives in Britain have, going back to Boris Johnson, have made a mess of it.
Quite exactly that. And I mean, I think a lot of people, polling suggests a lot of people actually trust Labour to handle immigration better than the Tories. And so all the things that the Tories are supposed to be good on, like the economy, borders, national defence, all these things, everybody has given up on the Conservatives. Well, not everybody, but the large majority of the British public have given up on the Conservative Party on those subjects. And they're going back towards Labour because Labour's historically been a very strong party in Britain. So we're going left electorally as Europe goes right. But we might just be in a different phase because actually if you look at what's going on the right, there's a crisis on the right. And out of that, we expect a lot of people expect, a more sort of reformer, more populist, I don't like the word, but a more populist, if you like, right to emerge.
In his 2019 book, The Return of the Strong Gods, the editor of First Things, Rusty Reno, argued that the West was moving away from its post-World War II consensus against the ties that bind a free people and back to what he called the strong gods of Western Christian civilization, like truth and patriotism and sovereignty and honor. Now, that was in 2019, so that's before COVID. I don't know if that would change Rusty's outlook based on the performance of the West during COVID. But do you see what happened this past week in those EU elections as sort of the return of the strong gods, small g, that Rusty Reno was talking about? Or is this just sort of a temporary tantrum reaction to what the left has done in the short term?
I don't think it's temporary at all. I think it's much more what Rusty Reno is talking about. I'd say, but it has to be understood that it's not a sort of return to kind of patriarchal honor in any sense, because if you look at a lot of these leaders, they're women. And in fact, it's interesting that it has to be a woman who pushes these movements forwards in France or Italy or Germany, indeed. All these parties are led by women, because men spouting very right-wing opinions tend to be sort of deemed toxic very quickly. And so I wonder where the kind
except in Argentina. Yeah.
Except in Argentina, yeah, quite right. But I wonder where the kind of post-Thatcher will come from for Britain. I don't know. I don't know where it will be. But it's certainly, I'd say it's much more substantial than just a sort of tantrum reaction. I think there is a movement that's been building up for decades now, and it's finally expressing it. France is an interesting one. I know a bit about this because my mother is French, and I talk to my French family a lot. But they are very conservative, very concerned about immigration and so on. But for a long time, they would never vote for Le Pen. Because of the old associations of her party, which were quite nasty,
right,
and also because it was, I mean, without wanting to, it was sort of seen as they're not snobs, but it was very much the sort of, it was the working class, rural working classes voted for Le Pen, the angry rural working classes, and so they didn't vote for him. But in recent years, they've started to change their minds a bit, and particularly with Macron, who they hate, and the French are incredibly united now in their loathing of Macron. They will. They find they may well find the motivation to vote for Le Pen.
So I mean, the Brexit movement from 2015 forward. I mean, this is a slow, rolling revolt that's had some fits and starts, but continues. Is that how you describe Western Europe?
Yes, I think so. And obviously, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I think there's a lot of that going on. But I mean, Brexit at the moment looks like a terrible failure, because none of the kind of promises that the people who campaigned for Brexit made have worked. Nigel Farage, who's the sort of leader of the British Brexit movement in many ways, he says repeatedly that Brexit is a failure. That doesn't mean he thinks we should go back and undo it, but he thinks that our political class have proved themselves incapable of delivering the opportunities that Brexit offered, which was Britain having its own place in the world outside of the European Union. It's a big debate in Britain, but I wonder, a lot of people think when Labour come in, even though Keir Starmer has said he doesn't want to do this, a lot of people think that the Labour Party will try and put Britain back into the European Union. And it'll be very interesting to see what they do.
Freddie Gray is the deputy editor of The Spectator and host of the Americano podcast. Freddie, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Great pleasure as ever.
Thank you. And
This is the morning show. More Chicago radio listeners are